This shelter works at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Yours won't. That isn't an insult, it's a timing problem. Most shelters are designed for cold you expect, the kind you can imagine enduring. -10 feels hostile. -20 feels serious. -30 feels extreme enough to respect. But -40 isn't colder, it's different. It doesn't punish mistakes. It removes margin. It removes forgiveness. It removes time. And most shelters are built on the assumption that time will still be available. This is about you, right now. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, failure doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic collapse, no sudden crisis. It arrives quietly, in sensations that are easy to dismiss. Your breath feels thinner than it should. Your hands stay stiff longer after movement. The walls stop feeling like protection and start feeling heavy, as if they're pressing inward. Most shelters don't break. They betray you gradually, while everything still looks intact. This is where most people get it wrong. They think survival at extreme cold is about insulation thickness, about materials, about stacking barriers between themselves and the environment. They build shelters that look strong, sealed, impressive. But the environment doesn't need to break your shelter. It only needs to outlast the assumptions you built into it. Strength doesn't matter if the system drifts out of tolerance over time. The mistake doesn't kill you immediately. It waits. It shows up as moisture collecting where you don't see it, inside layers you can't reach. In corners you don't check because nothing feels wrong yet. Heat loss isn't dramatic, it's constant, subtle. The structure keeps you alive for hours, maybe days, but not long enough. That's the danger zone, the place where people die believing they made the right choice. Remember this. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, a shelter isn't a structure, it's a system. Airflow interacts with humidity. Humidity interacts with insulation. Insulation interacts with body heat. Body heat interacts with fatigue. Fatigue interacts with judgment. Break any one of those links and the shelter becomes a trap with better lighting. It doesn't fail loudly. It fails politely. And it gets worse. Because cold creates overconfidence right before it shuts you down. You feel functional, alert, capable. You think you have time to adjust things later. That's when bad shelter design does its real damage, by convincing you nothing is wrong while the system is already sliding. This is the moment people misread as stability. A shelter that works at -40 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't aim to feel comfortable. Comfort masks feedback. It doesn't aim to feel airtight. Airtightness hides problems until they're irreversible. Instead, it looks boring, quiet. Almost wrong. It allows small discomfort so larger failures never have a chance to form. That's why most people never build it. They reject designs that don't look impressive. They distrust shelters that don't promise perfect warmth. They mistake silence for safety and solidity for security, and the cold waits patiently for that misunderstanding. By the time people realize the difference between a shelter that feels safe and one that actually is, the environment has already made its decision. The problem isn't the cold outside the shelter. It's the cold forming inside it. That distinction matters more than most people ever realize. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside environment is predictable. Brutal, yes, but stable. The inside is where variables multiply. That's where shelters quietly fail. Not because the cold gets in, but because something else builds up where it shouldn't. This is the part everyone misses. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, your body becomes two things at once, a heat source and a moisture factory. Every breath carries water vapor. Every movement redistributes heat unevenly. Most shelters are designed with a single goal, keep warmth inside. But warmth doesn't exist alone. Where heat stays, moisture follows. And where moisture stays, time runs out. The delayed consequence doesn't feel dangerous at first. In fact, it feels reassuring. The air feels warmer. The space feels sealed. You stop shivering. That sense of comfort is deceptive, because what you're experiencing isn't stability, it's accumulation. Moisture begins soaking into insulation. Frost forms silently along seams. Condensation settles in layers you can't see and won't check because nothing feels urgent yet. This is where it turns lethal. Once moisture freezes inside a shelter, insulation doesn't fail all at once. It degrades progressively. Each hour, the shelter retains slightly less heat than the hour before. The temperature drop is subtle, slow enough that you adapt to it instead of reacting. The cold doesn't rush you. It allows physics to work uninterrupted. This is why timelines matter more than temperature. The reframe matters here. Survival at -40 degrees Fahrenheit isn't about keeping heat in at all costs. It's about controlling where heat moves and how moisture escapes. Shelters that fail treat heat like a possession, something to hoard and trap. Shelters that work treat heat like a flow, managed, directed, allowed to move in controlled ways. To someone unfamiliar with extreme cold, that looks inefficient, wasteful even. Why let warmth escape? Why allow airflow? Why accept discomfort? Because preventing catastrophic failure requires allowing small, visible losses before they become hidden ones. Remember this detail. The most dangerous shelters are the ones that feel airtight and solid, the ones that promise to lock in warmth. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, anything locked in long enough becomes unstable. Materials, systems, and eventually you. Airtight comfort delays warning signs until correction is no longer possible. And it gets worse. Cold doesn't just drain heat, it erodes judgment. The longer you stay inside a failing shelter, the more invested you become in believing it's fine. Leaving feels like admitting a mistake. Adjusting feels unnecessary. People don't abandon bad shelters because they're stubborn. They abandon feedback. And the cold exploits that hesitation mercilessly. A shelter that works at -40 degrees Fahrenheit behaves differently. It gives you signals. Subtle feedback. Small discomforts that tell you something is changing while you still have options. Slight drafts. Uneven warmth. Audible shifts. These aren't flaws, they're communication. They keep you engaged with the system instead of hypnotized by false comfort. Most shelter designs remove those signals deliberately. Comfort sells. Silence reassures. Smooth surfaces feel safe. But at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, comfort without feedback is a countdown you can't see. That's why most shelters don't fail loudly. They fail politely, right up until they don't work at all. By now, the pattern should be impossible to ignore. Extreme cold doesn't kill through exposure. It kills through miscalculation. Not one big mistake, but a series of small assumptions that quietly stop being true while you're still inside the shelter. This is where most people get caught. They imagine shelter failure as something obvious. Wind forcing its way in. Walls giving out. Snow load collapsing a roof. Those are cinematic failures. At -40 degrees Fahrenheit, failure is administrative. It's a math problem that keeps changing while you're living inside it, and you don't realize the equation has shifted until the answer is already wrong. The mistake doesn't announce itself. It normalizes. You step onto colder floors and tell yourself it's expected. You notice frost creeping along the walls and accept it as cosmetic. You sleep lightly and blame stress. Each adjustment feels reasonable. Each one feels survivable. But together, they form a system drifting out of tolerance, one quiet compromise at a time. Remember this. A working -40 degrees Fahrenheit shelter isn't designed just to manage temperature. It's designed to manage people, fatigue, attention, decision-making, because humans don't fail at extreme cold when they panic. They fail when they're cold enough to be impaired but comfortable enough not to react. That gray zone is lethal. And it gets worse. Cold shelters train behavior. The wrong ones teach passivity. They reward staying still. They make movement feel expensive. You stop checking seams. Stop adjusting airflow. Stop responding to small changes because everything feels mostly fine. The shelter subtly demands that you do less, and you comply without noticing. That's a design failure masquerading as efficiency. The reframe is uncomfortable. A shelter that works at -40 degrees Fahrenheit often feels slightly wrong at first. There's airflow where you expect stillness. There are temperature differences instead of uniform warmth. Some areas feel cooler than others. To an untrained mind, that feels unsafe. It feels like a flaw. In reality, it's honesty. Uniform warmth is a lie at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Gradient is survival. Gradients allow moisture to move, heat to redistribute, problems to surface early instead of hiding. A shelter without gradients hides its failures until they're irreversible. A shelter with gradients forces you to stay aware, to stay engaged, to stay adaptive. This is why honest shelters don't feel luxurious. They don't try to convince you everything is under control. They keep you slightly alert, slightly involved, not anxious, but awake. They allow small discomforts, so large ones never arrive. By the time you understand this difference, your perception of shelter design changes completely. You stop asking which shelters look strongest. You start asking which ones communicate truthfully over time, which designs acknowledge physics, and which ones rely on hope. Hope freezes fast. In the next phase, when time stretches and conditions repeat, the difference between shelters that work and shelters that quietly kill becomes impossible to ignore. At negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the shelter stops being the problem. You become the variable. The structure can be perfect on paper and still fail if the person inside it drifts out of sync. This is where survival stops being mechanical and turns psychological. The cold doesn't need to break walls anymore. It waits for your behavior to change. Cold strips away excess behavior first. You stop fidgeting, stop talking. Stop correcting small things, not because you're calm, but because your body is conserving decision-making. Every choice feels heavier. Every movement feels like it costs more than it should. Most shelters accelerate this shutdown without ever accounting for it. This is the part people never design for. A bad shelter trains stillness. It rewards doing nothing. It makes movement feel expensive and unnecessary. Over time, you start negotiating with yourself. I'll fix that later. I'll check it tomorrow. It's probably fine. At negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, later isn't a plan. It's a gamble you don't know you're making. The delayed consequence is cognitive. You don't panic. Panic would be obvious. Instead, your thinking narrows. You focus on one problem and ignore everything else. The shelter convinces you that the primary threat, cold, is handled, so you stop scanning for secondary ones. That false confidence is lethal because it shuts down curiosity and correction. Remember this. A shelter that works at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit is designed to keep you engaged without draining you. It gives you reasons to move, to check, to interact with the environment in small, manageable ways. Not constant effort, not exhaustion, just enough activity to keep your awareness alive. And it gets worse. Shelters that fail most often do so at night, when metabolism drops, when your body produces less heat, when moisture freezes faster. When small heat losses compound without being noticed, the structure doesn't collapse. You do, slowly, while everything looks unchanged. This is why nighttime is the real test. A bad shelter encourages complete passivity. It invites you to shut down fully, to trust it blindly. A working shelter never lets you disappear completely into rest. It maintains a light cognitive load, subtle reminders that the system is alive and needs attention. The reframe matters here. Safety at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit isn't about minimizing effort. It's about distributing it over time. Shelters that work spread the workload so no single moment becomes critical. They prevent long periods of neglect by design, not by discipline. That's why some effective shelters feel oddly interactive, slightly demanding, almost annoying. They make you adjust, respond, notice. That irritation isn't a flaw, it's feedback. And feedback is what keeps the system and you alive when the cold is patient enough to wait. By now, you should understand why most shelters don't fail immediately. They fail on schedule, not because something dramatic happens, but because time exposes assumptions. Extreme cold is patient. It waits for routines to form, for confidence to settle in, for vigilance to feel unnecessary. This is where confidence becomes the enemy. After hours or days inside, the shelter starts to feel familiar, predictable. You learn its sounds, its temperatures, its rhythms. Familiarity feels like mastery, but it isn't. It's habituation, and while you're settling in, the cold is still working. Seals relax. Ice migrates along unseen paths. Airflow patterns shift subtly. At negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, stability is temporary by default. This is where most people get caught again. They build shelters that work once, or that pass a short test, or that perform well under ideal behavior. They step inside, feel warm, and declare success. But extreme cold doesn't care about demonstrations. It cares about repetition, about what happens on the third night, the fifth, the one where you're tired, distracted, and slightly careless. The mistake doesn't punish immediately. It waits until maintenance feels optional. Small checks get postponed. Minor adjustments get ignored. You stop asking if the system is drifting because nothing has gone wrong yet. That's when drift accelerates. The The shelter hasn't failed, you've stopped correcting it. Remember this detail. A shelter that works at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit assumes imperfection. It assumes you will forget things, that you will misjudge, that you will skip steps when you're exhausted. And it is designed to absorb those errors without collapsing. It doesn't require flawless behavior to survive time. Most shelters assume discipline. Discipline freezes. At minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, discipline erodes. Fingers stiffen. Motivation dulls. Precision slips. Systems that rely on constant correctness fail because humans cannot stay sharp indefinitely in extreme cold. A shelter that demands perfection is a countdown disguised as competence. And it gets worse. Recovery at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit is far harder than prevention. Once insulation is compromised, drying it may be impossible. Once airflow is blocked by ice, clearing it costs heat you don't have to spare. Once moisture migrates into the wrong layer, the problem becomes structural. Small errors stop being reversible and start becoming permanent conditions. This is where timelines collapse. The reframe is brutal. The best shelters don't feel optimized. They feel forgiving. They don't squeeze every ounce of efficiency out of materials. They leave slack. Redundancy, margin. They allow you to be human without turning that humanity into a liability. Forgiveness isn't weakness at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It's survival. When you understand this, shelter design stops looking impressive and starts looking honest. You stop asking how warm it feels on day one. You start asking how it behaves when attention fades, when fatigue sets in, when confidence replaces caution. Because at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the cold doesn't need you to fail loudly. It only needs you to believe the shelter no longer needs you. At the end of this, the truth becomes simple. This shelter works at negative 40 degrees because it doesn't try to win against the cold. Winning implies domination, control, superiority. Extreme cold doesn't respond to any of that. It responds to physics. Time, human limits. The shelter that survives understands this and stops pretending otherwise. It cooperates with reality instead of arguing with it. That cooperation looks like compromise to people who don't understand timelines. Heat is allowed to move instead of being trapped. Moisture is guided instead of denied. Small losses are permitted so larger ones never form. This shelter doesn't aim for perfection. It aims for balance. That difference is everything at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It accepts loss without panic. Every system operating in extreme cold will lose heat. It will accumulate moisture. It will drift. Shelters that fail treat these facts as enemies to be eliminated. Shelters that work treat them as conditions to be managed. They don't try to seal you off from the environment. They try to keep the interaction honest and visible. Most shelters lie. They promise safety through isolation, through strength, through denial of physics. They look solid, airtight, reassuring. And for a while, they deliver comfort, warmth, quiet, the feeling that the problem has been solved. But comfort is not survival. Comfort is how cold buys time. Remember this. At minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, survival isn't about toughness. It's about humility. Humility means acknowledging that you will make mistakes, that your body will tire, that your judgment will slip. A working shelter is built around those truths, not in spite of them. It doesn't require you to be exceptional. It allows you to be human. That's why these shelters don't look heroic. They don't photograph well. They don't impress people who think survival is about strength and cleverness. They don't promise absolute protection. They look plain, conservative, sometimes even inefficient. And because of that, most people dismiss them. That's why yours probably won't look like it. And that's why yours probably won't work. Extreme cold doesn't kill the unprepared first. It kills the confident, the ones who believe the shelter has solved the problem completely. The ones who stop paying attention because everything feels under control. The cold waits patiently for that belief to settle in. Then it collects the interest. It doesn't rush. It doesn't escalate. It just keeps applying pressure until the system drifts beyond what the human inside can correct. By the time failure is obvious, options are gone. At negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the only thing that keeps you alive is a design that assumes you're human, that you will adapt imperfectly, that you will miss things, that you will need feedback before you need rescue. Everything else is just a delay.